John Neely Kennedy called Ted Cruz a thug on live TV, thinking it would humiliate him. But just minutes later, the entire room went silent, because Cruz's response stunned everyone. By the end, one man was exposed and the other walked out stronger. Don't scroll. This is the moment they didn't want you to see. No one expected a routine Senate Judiciary Committee session to erupt into a political reckoning. Cameras were rolling, reporters typing, and then, out of nowhere, Senator John Neely Kennedy leaned into his microphone with a theatrical smirk and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "You, Senator Cruz, have become nothing more than a thug in a suit." The room shifted. Even some of Kennedy's allies looked uncomfortable. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was charged. Everyone turned, expecting Cruz to fire back with fire, to lash out, to grandstand. But Ted Cruz didn't raise his voice. He didn't even flinch. He leaned forward, gently tapped the mic, and calmly said, "Interesting." That single word turned the temperature of the room. "I've been called worse," Cruz said, his voice steady, almost conversational. "But I'll tell you what I haven't been called: out of touch. Not by the people back in Texas who send me letters every week wondering why Washington feels more like a red carpet gala than a place meant to solve real problems." He paused. The camera zoomed in. "I got a letter last week from a single mother named Carla. She's working 2 jobs and still can't afford insulin for her daughter. You want to talk about thuggery? Try letting a child go without medicine while you smile for Vanity Fair." A few senators shifted in their seats. Kennedy blinked but said nothing. "I know it's tempting to treat this chamber like a game show," Cruz continued, "but I wasn't elected to entertain. I was elected to serve. And that doesn't mean sneering at people we don't bother to understand." He reached into a folder and pulled out a small, wrinkled paper. "This is from an 11-year-old girl in Amarillo. She wrote in her own handwriting, 'Why do the people who make the rules live so differently than the rest of us?'" Cruz paused again. "That hit me, Senator Kennedy, because I didn't have an answer." Silence. He folded the note, laid it neatly on the desk, and looked Kennedy dead in the eyes. "I may be many things, but I'm not a man who's forgotten who he works for." The reaction was instant. Online, the clip exploded. Hashtags trended. Commentators scrambled to cover what had just unfolded. And as Kennedy sat back in his chair, clearly caught off guard, the internet had already reached its verdict. Cruz hadn't just responded. He had redirected the insult like a boomerang. And that was just the beginning. Committee Chair Dick Durbin tried to continue the hearing, his voice unsteady, calling the next speaker. But no one was listening. The attention was still on Cruz, on his composure, his clarity. On Kennedy, the camera showed visible discomfort. And then Kennedy made it worse. "I won't apologize for calling out extremism," he muttered into his mic, his voice cracking just enough to betray unease. "Senator Cruz knows exactly what he's doing when he throws red meat to angry voters. That's not leadership, it's manipulation. That's not leadership, it's manipulation." A quiet gasp swept across the room, not because of the insult itself, but because of what had just happened. Senator John Neely Kennedy hadn't just insulted Ted Cruz. He had insulted the people Cruz had just spoken for. The struggling mother, the handwritten letter from an 11-year-old girl, the everyday Americans whose stories are almost never heard on cable news. And Cruz? He waited. Then slowly, with a tone even steadier than before, he responded, his voice low, restrained, but piercing. "So that's where we are now?" he asked, eyes locked on Kennedy. "You just called the American people angry and manipulated, the same people you're supposed to represent. You sit in a city with the highest homelessness rate in the nation," Cruz continued, his tone never rising, "and you haven't fixed a single thing. But sure, lecture us from the moral high ground." This time, the silence in the chamber was different, heavier. Tense murmurs spread across the benches. A few senators exchanged glances. Cruz leaned forward just slightly. "You want to talk about manipulation?" he continued. "You promised transparency to your voters, and yet you've buried more documents than you have ever released. No theatrics, no finger-pointing, no raised voice. That's what made it so unsettling. It wasn't performance, it was precision." Kennedy leaned back, tapping his pen nervously. He looked uncertain for the first time. His staff behind him offered no help, just tight expressions and quiet dread. Cruz didn't stop. "People in my state don't care about committee sound bites," he said. "They care about whether they can afford to fill up their tank, whether fentanyl will reach their kids' school, why everything costs more while you fly private jets to climate conferences in Europe." The room fell still again. This time, even Democratic senators looked unsure whose side they were on. It was no longer a feud. It was a shift. What started as a cheap jab had become something bigger, something uncomfortable. Outside the chamber, the news cycle exploded. Breaking, Cruz flips the script on Kennedy. Kennedy's insult backfires in real time. In 30 minutes, the clip had 500,000 views. Commentators couldn't get enough. Ted Cruz just did what no one else could, answer arrogance and with fact, and do it without blinking. And as the next senator began to speak, almost no one listened. Kennedy had started a fire he couldn't put out. In the hallway, reporters swarmed the exits before the hearing even ended. Everyone wanted a reaction, but neither man stepped out. Not yet. Inside, things remained electric. Senator Cruz quietly passed a few papers to a clerk and leaned back like he was done. But he wasn't. A moment later, he raised his hand. "Just one more thing," he said. The room froze. Even the chair didn't object. Kennedy looked over, briefly, but avoided eye contact. Cruz held up a printed page. "This is a city council report from Los Angeles County," he began. "It says 75,000 people are homeless. That's more than the population of entire towns in my state, and that number's gone up year after year." He let the silence hang in the air, then added, "And yet we're told this is leadership, this is progress, this is how it's supposed to work." He set the paper down gently. "People back home see all of this. They hear you call me names, but what they never hear is how anything you're doing actually helps them." A few members shifted again, this time not in discomfort, but in realization. It wasn't just discomfort anymore, it was reflection. Cruz had dragged the conversation back to the core, what government is supposed to be and who it's supposed to serve. Senator John Neely Kennedy, now visibly agitated, broke the silence. "Well, maybe if you and your party spent less time grandstanding and more time negotiating in good faith," but Cruz cut in without raising his voice. "Negotiating with whom?" he asked, still seated, eyes steady. "The bureaucrats? The unelected advisors? The lobbyists you meet with behind closed doors?" He shook his head slightly. "That's not negotiation, Senator. That's theater." The line hit hard. You could feel it in the room. "You call me a thug because I speak directly to voters," Cruz continued, "because I won't sit quietly while this place sinks under its own weight. But you know what I really am?" He stood up slowly, collecting his folder with deliberate calm. "I'm inconvenient, that's all." He took a step forward, facing Kennedy without flinching. "I don't wear a halo, Senator Kennedy, but I walk into every diner, every school, every VFW hall in Texas, and I look people in the eye." He paused. "Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. No one spoke. No one moved. Finally, the chair cleared his throat, his voice almost a whisper. "We're going to recess for 10 minutes. But nobody stood. The chamber was still frozen in that moment. Then Cruz turned and walked through the hallway doors, directly into a wall of reporters and flashing cameras. Microphones surged toward him, but he raised a hand and waved them off. "I'll speak in a bit," he said. "Let the room breathe first." Back inside, Kennedy never left his seat. He stared down at the table, the smirk long gone. The insult he had hurled for attention had become the most watched political moment of the year, and not in the way he'd hoped. Outside, the media frenzy reached a boiling point. Cable anchors cut into live programming. News tickers screamed breaking headlines. And over, one clip played on a loop. Cruz holding up that handwritten letter, his voice quiet, saying, "I didn't have an answer." It wasn't bombast that hurt Kennedy. It was vulnerability, and people connected with it. Back in the chamber, Kennedy huddled with two aides in a corner, whispering. He was clearly debating his next move. One staffer leaned in and said quietly, "Let it pass." But Kennedy wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on his tablet. His name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Then in a moment of defiance, he stood and walked toward the press doors. Technically, the hearing was still in recess, but reporters spotted him immediately and cleared a path. "I stand by what I said," Kennedy told them, forcing a grin. "I don't apologize for defending democracy from those who cheapen it with culture wars and inflammatory rhetoric." But the follow-up came quick and sharp. "Do you think calling a fellow senator a thug helps defend democracy?" That made him pause. The smirk faltered. "Well, I think sometimes people need to be called out when they're acting out of line." It was clumsy, defensive, weak. The press sensed blood in the water. And worse, the public wasn't with him. Because while Kennedy was scrambling to salvage a headline, Cruz was walking the hallways, shaking hands with staffers, interns, even janitors. No press, no entourage, just presence. And someone caught it on video. By the time Cruz emerged for his official press remarks, the clip was already everywhere, captioned, "Cruz doesn't talk down, he walks with them." He stepped up to the podium, papers in hand, the same quiet strength in his posture. "I didn't come here today to argue," Cruz began. "I came to speak for people who are usually ignored. I've got no time to waste trading insults with career politicians who've forgotten what this place is supposed to be." Cruz reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, worn note card. "This is a quote from my grandfather. I keep it with me as a reminder." He held it up between two fingers. It says, "Don't raise your voice, improve your argument." I try to live by that. The reporters didn't interrupt. No one shouted. No one moved. They just listened. "I'm not going to return personal attacks," Cruz added, "but I will keep telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable." There was a pause, then applause, not thunderous but genuine. Reporters, staffers, even a few tourists near the entrance of the building clapped with quiet respect. As Cruz turned to leave the podium, someone called out, "Senator Cruz, do you consider Senator Kennedy a friend?" Cruz paused for half a second. "I consider him a reminder." And with that, he walked off. By mid-afternoon, the confrontation had gone viral. News outlets ran wall-to-wall coverage. YouTubers clipped it. Podcasters dissected it. Commentators from both sides couldn't stop talking. But the momentum, it was all Cruz's. Clips of Kennedy's insult were everywhere, but always followed by Cruz's cool, cutting dismantling. The contrast was brutal. One looked petty, the other looked principled. At the Capitol, Cruz's office phone rang nonstop. Calls poured in from voters, fellow senators, even a few Democrats who quietly admitted Kennedy had gone too far. Meanwhile, inside Kennedy's office, the mood was bleak. Staffers argued. One aide suggested a carefully worded tweet to clarify the context. Another warned, "Whatever we say now will make it worse." That's when Kennedy made a call, not to a strategist, but to a cable news producer. He wanted to go live. He thought he could fix it. Later that night, Kennedy sat stiffly across from a familiar anchor in a sterile TV studio. Lights on, mic clipped, smile, forced. "Senator Kennedy, you called Ted Cruz a thug today during a live hearing. Do you regret that word?" Kennedy deflected. "I regret that the conversation shifted from real issues to personal drama," he said. "My intention was to highlight behavior, not attack character." But the anchor pressed, "Would you use that word again?" Kennedy hesitated. Maybe not that word," he said awkwardly. "But the sentiment stands." That single moment, those 7 seconds, were clipped, captioned, and uploaded before the interview even ended. And the internet rejected it. It didn't sound like strength. It sounded like regret wearing a mask of pride. Meanwhile, Cruz was already back in Texas. Not hiding, not scheming, listening. He was hosting a town hall. Hundreds showed up, more than expected. They had to bring in extra folding chairs. But the energy was different. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about trust. And Ted Cruz had earned more of it by doing something remarkably rare, standing his ground without lowering himself. During the Q&A, a woman stood and asked about what happened in D.C. Cruz nodded. "I didn't plan to be in a viral video," he said quietly. "I planned to tell the truth. And sometimes the truth stings people who aren't used to hearing it." The crowd didn't erupt. They clapped softly but with meaning. Then from the back of the room, a teenager raised his hand. His voice cracked as he asked, "Do you ever get tired of fighting?" Cruz looked straight at him. "All the time," he said, "but I never get tired of defending the people who can't fight back. That's what keeps me going." That 14-second clip was posted that night. By morning, it had over 4 million views. Kennedy tried to win with a headline. Cruz won with a letter, a note card, and the quiet power of listening. And by then, the nation wasn't just watching, it was remembering. The nation was remembering. By Monday morning, the conversation had shifted. What began as a petty insult inside a Judiciary Committee hearing had ignited something deeper, something personal for millions of Americans who had felt unseen for far too long. Every major outlet was dissecting the fallout, but this time the focus wasn't on who won the exchange. It was on what it revealed. Editorial headlines didn't mince words. Is Washington out of touch? Cruz strikes a chord. Kennedy misses the moment. Even normally left-leaning commentators acknowledged that Kennedy's insult had backfired spectacularly. One journalist put it plainly, "You don't call a man a thug for reading a letter from an 11-year-old girl. You just don't." But Ted Cruz wasn't watching cable news. He wasn't refreshing headlines. He wasn't polishing a victory lap. He was focused on the follow-through. Back at his Texas office, his staff sorted through a flood of messages. Voicemails from veterans, emails from single moms, handwritten letters from towns most senators had never even heard of. And then, a call came in. A staffer picked up. On the other end, Carla, the single mother Cruz had referenced during the hearing. She didn't expect to reach him. She just wanted to say thank you. Cruz took the call. She was crying. "I didn't think anyone up there knew people like me existed," she said. "But when you read my letter, you made me feel seen." Cruz didn't say much. He just listened. And when she finished, he said one thing, something simple. "You're why I ran." Later that evening, Cruz's team posted a short message online. No video, no filters, just plain text on a black background. Leadership isn't loud, it's listening, and it starts by remembering who you work for. That post was shared over 1 million times by midnight. Back in D.C., things were quiet, but not peacefully so. Kennedy's office was in damage control. The press requests had dried up. The cameras had moved on. Inside his inner circle, frustration simmered. Every attempt to recapture the narrative had failed. The moment had gotten away from them, and now it was something they couldn't spin. Because at its core, this wasn't about partisanship anymore. It was about authenticity. Cruz hadn't delivered a performance. He delivered a message. And while Kennedy clung to accusations and talking points, Cruz had spoken a truth that cut across party lines. That's what made it sting. Kennedy hadn't just lost the argument. He'd lost the crowd. And deep down, he knew it. As the week rolled on, Cruz returned to the Senate floor quietly, without fanfare. No cameras, no press team, just a folder under his arm, the same calm stride as always. But this time, even his critics couldn't ignore him. He wasn't just a senator anymore. He was the man who reminded Washington what it had forgotten. The ripple effects came fast. The next judiciary hearing Cruz attended wasn't even televised. But word spread anyway. Something felt different. Colleagues who once brushed past him now nodded with quiet respect. Even staffers from across the aisle offered subtle glances, small but unmistakable signs that something had shifted. Kennedy wasn't there. His office said he was reconsidering public appearances in light of the backlash. But insiders knew the truth. He was regrouping, unsure how to face a chamber that had already moved on without him. In the days that followed, Ted Cruz introduced a motion on the Senate floor, a proposal to reallocate unused federal administrative funds toward a nationwide pilot program for affordable insulin access. It was practical, targeted, achievable, and it came with letters attached. Letters from real people. Carla's was one of them. Cruz didn't mention Kennedy, not once. He didn't have to. The contrast now spoke for itself. While Kennedy was drafting damage control statements and obsessing over approval polls, Cruz was doing the one thing voters had stopped expecting from their representatives: delivering results. Back in Texas, Cruz's approval numbers began to climb, not just among conservatives, but independents, and even some moderate Democrats. Not because they suddenly agreed with him on every issue, but because he had done something rare. He had made them feel heard. Meanwhile, pundits tried to stir the pot. They begged for a rematch. They asked if Cruz would respond further. They baited him, tried to push him into another round. But he didn't bite. In a short interview outside the Capitol, a reporter asked, "Senator, would you call John Neely Kennedy your political enemy?" Cruz paused, then shook his head. "No," he said, "just someone who forgot who he works for." And then he walked away. That single sentence replayed on loop across the evening news. It wasn't angry, it wasn't mocking. It was disappointed. And somehow that stung worse for Kennedy, because the story had moved on from a single insult. It had become a national case study on what leadership looks like when the cameras stop rolling. Kennedy had thrown the first punch, but Cruz didn't throw one back. He redirected it, used it, turned it into something powerful, and voters noticed. On social media, a phrase began to take hold: "Do it the Cruz way." It appeared under town hall videos. It was tweeted in response to partisan grandstanding. It became a quiet rebellion against performative politics. And against Kennedy. His name was still trending, but now it was a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition outpaces accountability. Behind closed doors, Kennedy's team held an emergency meeting. The numbers weren't just bad, they were brutal. His favorability had taken a hit, especially among moderates. Donors had gone silent. A major San Francisco fundraiser had been postponed twice. And the infamous clip of him calling Cruz a thug? Now it was appearing in campaign ads against him. But Cruz? He wasn't playing along. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't tweeting barbs. He wasn't doubling down. He was simply moving forward. Focused, quiet, consistent. And that silence was deafening. Because in politics, there's nothing more dangerous than an opponent who doesn't play your game. Meanwhile, Cruz's insulin proposal gained real traction. 3 senators from across the aisle signed on. More were expected. Analysts called it shockingly practical. But Cruz wasn't chasing headlines. He walked into every meeting the same way. No cameras, no entourage, just facts and people's stories. He brought the letters with him every time, and every time it worked. Even longtime skeptics began to admit it. The senator who once delivered fiery zingers and constitutional barbs has become one of the most effective voices in the room. He wasn't grandstanding anymore. He was governing. He was governing. And it made Kennedy's earlier insult look even more hollow by the day. Eventually, Kennedy tried to pivot. He posted a long Twitter thread about the dangers of populist rhetoric and how it threatens democratic norms. But no one cared. Replies were flooded with a single phrase: "Do it the Cruz way." He tried again, this time with a polished, scripted video message, loaded with graphics and dramatic lighting. It was ignored within hours, because authenticity can't be edited in post-production. Meanwhile, Cruz's team quietly posted a 43-second clip. He was sitting on a folding chair in a small-town high school gym, answering questions from a group of teenagers. One kid asked, "What do you think politicians get wrong most?" Cruz smiled. "They talk too much and listen too little." That clip reached 6 million views in 2 days, and slowly the national narrative began to shift. Cable shows started comparing Cruz's approach to old-school senators, men who rose not by shouting, but by understanding. Voters noticed, not just in Texas, across the country, because while Kennedy scrambled to reclaim his image, Cruz was building something more valuable: trust. And in Washington, trust is currency. By the end of the week, Cruz's insulin bill was scheduled for committee debate, and as the votes lined up, something became clear to everyone watching. The man Kennedy tried to humiliate was now leading the most talked about bipartisan effort in months. And he had done it without raising his voice once. The Senate chamber was unusually full that day. Staffers, journalists, even a few members of the public quietly filed in. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just a policy vote. It was a test of leadership, humility, and who the Senate was still willing to follow. Cruz sat quietly near the front, the same note card still tucked in his jacket pocket. No press aids, no cameras, just a single folder and a stack of letters from all over America. Louisiana, Oregon, Ohio, they all said the same thing. Thank you for listening. When his name was called, Cruz rose and walked slowly to the podium. The room went still. This isn't a Republican idea, and it's not a Democrat idea, he said. It's an American idea that no one should have to choose between food and medicine. He held up a letter. This one's from a dad in Iowa, lost his wife last year. Now he is raising 2 kids alone. His boy's diabetic. And guess what? He can't afford insulin, not because it doesn't exist, but because this town forgot what it means to struggle. No shouting, no finger pointing, just truth. While some folks up here are worried about sound bites and cable hits, Cruz continued, I'm worried about the next generation losing faith that this place ever mattered at all. A few senators looked away, some lowered their eyes. The bill passed through committee with unexpected ease. Even those who had doubted him before nodded quietly in agreement. The vote wasn't close, and when reporters later asked one senator why the bill had passed so overwhelmingly, the answer was simple. Because Cruz reminded us why we're here. And just like that, the man Kennedy had dismissed as a thug had become the man who united a divided chamber. Not with sound, not with stunts, but with humanity. Kennedy was notably absent from the vote. His office cited a scheduling issue, but everyone knew the truth. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the man who showed up with letters, with stories, with quiet strength, and who reminded Washington that you don't need to shout to be heard. You just have to care. His office claimed a scheduling conflict, but no one believed that. The truth was clear. After weeks of headlines, backlash, and silence, John Neely Kennedy hadn't just lost an argument. He had lost relevance. That same week, a political cartoon went viral across social media. It showed Ted Cruz planting a flag in the middle of a bridge, while behind him, shattered microphones and toppled cameras lay abandoned. In the distance, Kennedy stood alone, shouting into the void. No one was listening. Because in the end, Cruz didn't need to win a debate. He just needed to remind the country that conviction doesn't have to be loud, and respect doesn't come from titles. It comes from trust. Weeks later, the story still echoed, not because of the insult, but because of what came after it. Cruz's insulin bill passed the full Senate with bipartisan support. It was signed into law 1 month later. The headlines didn't scream. They didn't have to. The victory spoke for itself. Families began reporting lower insulin prices. Pharmacies updated signage. Parents in small towns breathed a little easier. And Cruz? He didn't gloat. He didn't take a victory lap. He just said, "It's a start," and went back to work. But in Washington, everyone knew what had just happened. A single moment of disrespect, meant to humiliate, had backfired so completely, it reshaped the public image of both men. Kennedy, once seen as sharp-witted and confident, now wore the label of arrogance. Cruz, often dismissed as overly polished or political, was suddenly being seen in a new light, one of the most grounded, effective, and consistent voices in Congress. Commentators had to reevaluate. One podcast host said it best, Cruz didn't win because he clapped back. He won because he didn't. He stayed calm, he told the truth. He proved that you don't have to scream to be heard, you just have to care. Meanwhile, Kennedy tried to reclaim some footing. He quietly issued a statement congratulating Cruz on the insulin bill, but it felt hollow. Too late, too scripted. The public had already moved on. And more importantly, they had already chosen who they believed. Back in Texas, Cruz continued his town hall tour. No cameras, no press alerts, just school gyms, community centers, and corner cafes. He brought the same folder with him, the same stack of letters. People hugged him, some cried, some just shook his hand and said, "Thank you for not forgetting us." At one small event outside Houston, a little girl walked up to him. She handed him a folded piece of notebook paper, torn at the edges. It read, "Thank you for reading my letter. You made me feel important. My mom said you gave us hope." Cruz smiled and gently tucked the letter inside his folder, right next to Carla's. Then he looked out at the modest crowd and said, "Washington likes to pretend it's a stage, But I don't act, I serve. And I'll keep doing that until the day they show me the door. It was a quiet line, one that wouldn't make national headlines. But it didn't need to, because the people who heard it, they understood exactly what it meant. In the end, Kennedy's insult didn't destroy Ted Cruz. It defined him, but not in the way Kennedy ever intended.